I want to talk about a decision someone made, probably in a room full of men, that is still costing women money today. Not a new law, not something from last week. A classification that got baked into state tax codes decades ago and has been quietly extracting money from women ever since. In 18 states right now, you pay a sales tax every time you buy a tampon or a pad. Not because it makes logical sense, because of who was in the room when the rules got written and who wasn't. This is the tampon tax, and it's not really about tampons. It's about how systems encode the priorities of the people who build them. Let's start at the beginning, because the origin of this tax tells you everything. The FDA originally classified menstrual products as cosmetics. Cosmetics. The same regulatory bucket as lipstick and perfume. Things you choose to buy. Things you could skip if you wanted to. That classification shaped how states taxed them. Most states exempt necessities, groceries, medicine, things you can opt out of. But if the federal government is telling you tampons are cosmetics, well, cosmetics aren't necessities, so they get taxed. By the 1970s, Congress had reclassified menstrual products as medical devices for consumer labeling purposes. The government officially acknowledged these are medical. These are necessary. Now, that reclassification happened over 50 years ago. The sales tax stayed anyway. In most states, nobody touched it. The label changed, the tax code didn't. Two separate systems, two separate fights. And the second fight, the one over money, moved very slowly. Minnesota was the first state to eliminate the tampon tax, and they did it in 1981. One state, 1981. That was 45 years ago. It took the rest of the country another 4 decades to catch up, and 18 states still haven't. I want to spend some time here because this is the part that makes the logic completely collapse. States make choices about what counts as a necessity, and these choices are encoded in tax exemptions. And when you look at what gets exempted versus what doesn't, a pattern emerges that is very hard to explain with anything other than who had power when those decisions were made. Groceries, exempt in most states. Prescription drugs, exempt almost everywhere. Prosthetics, exempt. Farming equipment, exempt in many states. Erectile dysfunction medication and golf club memberships are typically tax exempt in states that still tax menstrual products. Let that sit for a moment. The system that looked at a tampon and said that's a luxury also looked at golf membership and said that's essential. That's not an accident. That is a priorities list, and it was written by people whose priorities did not include the monthly biological reality of half the population. And if you think that's just historical, that we've since corrected it, South Carolina only eliminated their tampon tax in 2024, and only after lawmakers paired the bill with a tax break on for-profit golf club memberships. That's not ancient history. That deal was made 2 years ago. Golf got a seat at the table. Women's periods had to hitch a ride. Let's get concrete about what this tax actually costs. Right now, 18 states charge sales tax on period products with rates running as high as 7% in Indiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Over a lifetime, period products cost around $6,000 per person before tax. And the tax on top of that in states where it applies, and you're looking at hundreds of dollars more over a lifetime just for the tax, not for the products, just for the government's cut of the products. Collectively, U.S. states pull in more than $150 million a year from this tax. $150 million collected exclusively from people who menstruate. There is no equivalent tax that applies only to men. This one applies only to women and others who menstruate by design because of what the product is. And that burden does not fall evenly. There are nearly 22 million women living in poverty in the U.S. who cannot afford menstrual hygiene products. In one study, 64% of low-income women reported being unable to afford the menstrual products they needed in the past year. 21% experienced this every single month. and 46% had faced a choice between buying food and buying period products in the previous year. Not food versus a vacation, not food versus a new phone. Food versus the thing they need to participate in daily life, to go to school, to go to work, to leave the house. Period poverty causes 1 in 3 low-income women to miss work, school, or other opportunities. 61% of low-income women in the U.S. report using rags, toilet paper, or their children's diapers as substitutes when they can't afford period products. That is what the luxury classification costs in the real world. Here's the part I want you to really hold on to. None of this was inevitable. None of this was a neutral outcome of some objective tax policy process. It was the direct result of who was making decisions and whose needs were centered as normal. When the assemblywoman who finally ended the tampon tax in New York explained why it had taken so long, she said it was a tax levied at a time when women were not part of government and the decision-making process. That's the architecture. A decision gets made. The decision encodes the blind spots of the people who made it. The decision becomes law. The law gets treated as neutral fact. Years pass, decades pass, and the cost of that original blind spot keeps getting extracted quietly, automatically, every time someone buys a box of tampons at a drugstore in Tennessee. This is how systemic inequality actually works most of the time. Not through dramatic, obvious acts, through defaults, through what gets exempted and what doesn't, through what gets called a necessity and what gets called a luxury, through who is assumed to be the default human being whose needs get built into the system and who isn't. 10% of female college students are unable to afford menstrual products each month, leading to missed classes. These are not women living on the street. These are college students. And they are missing class, falling behind academically, because the tax code decided their biology was a luxury. 18 states still have this tax. Several of them have active legislation trying to end it right now. Some of those bills will pass, some will stall because somebody decides the revenue loss isn't worth it. $150 million spread across state budgets that collect billions. A rounding error, except it isn't a rounding error to the woman choosing between a box of tampons and dinner. The tax code is not neutral. It never was. It reflects the values and the blind spots of whoever wrote it. And when you look at what gets exempted and what gets taxed, you get a very clear picture of whose needs were considered obvious and whose were treated like an afterthought. I'm Lil, and this is Lil Unfiltered.